Right. I'm going to start in a couple of seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. If you're new to the chat, please make sure it's set to everyone when you're chatting so that everybody can see your chat. And introduce yourselves, your name, surname, the organization you're with, your location, that'll be great. We also tell us what you hope to hear or learn from this conversation. AI is a very hot topic and will continue to be. And today we're zoning in on how it impacts recruitment in particular, with many organizations trying to get ahead of the curve as far as implementing HR and their employee experience is concerned. Recruitment is definitely one of those areas that has been sharply impacted on both sides, from the organization and from the applicant side. So we're going to be here to discuss that really, and how do we make the best of this amazing tool that at times is vulnerable to exploitation by candidates. I think it's 1 minute past 11 now, so I'm going to get right into it. And just to set the scene a little bit more, the benefit of AI is that it's really transformed recruitment quite fast, and in many cases faster than organizations have been able to adapt. At the same time, there's been something of a paradox in the sense that the same technology that makes hiring faster, more consistent, and more defensible is also being used by candidates to game the system. So while AI really helps at speed, it also often tells you what to think, and it tells you what you think you want. So it's really much dependent on the input you give it. And what many people are learning is that any prompt, any use of AI is only as strong as the data you give it to work with. And to make suitable hiring decisions, you need to be able to master that part of the scale, I guess. So we're going to be delving into a conversation where we're talking into that paradox of the yin and yang of AI, so to speak, as far as recruitment is concerned. I'm going to introduce our panel. All of them are from Lumenii, who are also the sponsors of this particular webinar. In no particular order, we've got the Managing Director, who is Benjamin Buckingham, the Delivery Director, who is Jayanthan Naidu, as well as the Head of Product, Caitlin Quibell, or Quibell rather. And together we're going to really delve into this hot topic. Based on the number of registrants we've received for this webinar, it's clearly a topic a lot of people want to get into. And I'm sure you're all really looking forward to this conversation. Please don't send your AI bots to come and record and be a part of this conversation. They will be rejected. And also, if you're here to punt your business, you'll be removed from the webinars. In many instances, we've had people say, I'm a recruitment specialist, email me, and what are we? This is not the platform for that. Please refrain from punting your businesses in the chat. We're really here to learn from the guests. Before we get going, we have something that has never been done before, if I can recollect, in that Lumenii is sponsoring a prize for the most engaged people. So there'll be a 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher for the best comment, and also another 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher for the best questions that is asked throughout the webinar. So be sure to be engaged. You've got some additional motivation to do so. All right, without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to go off cam while Caitlin does her presentation. Caitlin is going to kind of set the scene for us as to what we're discussing today, what are the various talking points and themes that we're going to be tackling in more depth when we get to the panel discussion portion. No need to raise your hands. I see there are a couple of raised hands in the chat. Simply put your question in the chat. I will make sure we have somebody in the back end who's keeping a record of all the questions, and we'll make sure that they're asked when that time comes. Over to you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Sangula. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. And just to reassure everyone, we will be sending out the recording as well and the copy of the slides. I know that those are some of the most common questions we get asked at the beginning of a webinar. And yes, we really appreciate the comments, the questions, so please keep them coming. Anything we don't get to in the live Q&A, we will endeavor to respond to after the webinar. All right. So I'm going to steal the first portion of today's discussion and run through a short set of slides to, as Sungula said, set the scene, talk a little bit about, how AI is showing up in organizations, where they might be getting it right, where they might be falling short, and how to close the gap. And before we get into the detail, I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce Lumenii. So at Lumenii, we are a team of psychologists and HR specialists who are on the ground to see the shift in AI happening, in real time, both in the market in general and, of course, with our clients. So what we actually do as a business spans the full talent lifecycle. We offer direct recruitment. We specialize in psychometric assessments and technology, and we feed these insights into succession planning, talent management, and then, of course, down the line into employee development and performance. So that gives us an interesting perspective in that we can see how a hiring decision plays out, both at the time of hire, but also for years afterwards. Then, personally, I am a research psychologist by training, and I currently head up the product team at Lumenii, which means I work directly on our software, on our assessments, and on our tools to help solve needs for clients as they arise in this new sort of AI-shaped reality. And that it also includes our own AI-enabled tools. So, everything we're going to talk about today comes from our best practices and our direct experience, as I mentioned. Starting off with a paradox that we've observed as AI comes to the fore. So we're seeing more and more companies start to use it, and we're seeing that it helps recruitment teams move more quickly. But that same tool is helping candidates get better at telling you what you want to hear. So the better AI gets for recruiters, the better it gets for candidates as well. And then the question we need to ask ourselves is there a risk that we're all going to end up further from the truth and not closer to it? At this point, I would love to hear more from the audience. And Sungula, I'm going to ask you to pop up a poll. And we're going to ask, what is your organization's current stance on using AI in your recruitment process? So we love to hear about, are you just starting with AI? Are you hesitant to get involved? Are you waiting and seeing? Or are you actually, like I said, jumping in and, you know, using it wherever you can? And I'm just going to give this another couple of seconds, and then we'll run through the results, and then we'll move on to the rest of the slides. Interestingly, so far, we're seeing the majority of responses coming out as experimenting. So using AI for specific non-critical tasks, or maybe just getting started in this realm of AI in recruitment. All right, and I'm going to pop the results up on your screen. So these are what some of the results tell us. About 1/4 saying that they're all in using AI across the board to speed up screening and sourcing. That's really, exciting to hear that we have, early adopters joining the call today. About half saying that they're experimenting, using it in specific areas, maybe still looking at how to, expand upon it. 17% are cautious and 11% zero, still getting to grips with what the impact would be in their organization. So yes, we're very excited to have people from all different perspectives, and hopefully you can all learn something in the remainder of this presentation. and webinar. So we wanted to look at what the research is telling us and some, interesting metrics from the data. So we see a couple of interesting points come to the fore. First of all, we see about 69% of companies report using AI in hiring to some extent, and a much smaller percentage report using it across their entire process, right? About 18%. And that's interesting because that kind of reflects what we just saw in the poll. What that tells me is if we look across the board, we're seeing wide adoption. A lot of people are dabbling, a lot of people are experimenting, but we're seeing that the adoption is quite shallow. That, it might be that people are still cautious or they're still figuring out how to use it strategically across their process. The second metric that I'd like to highlight is that candidates are moving faster than the organizations assessing them, with around 3/4 noting that they use AI in their application process. And then I thought it was interesting to look at when companies use AI, where are they using it? With the majority noting that they're using it in screening as well as candidate communications. And then lastly, something to note, a lot of us might be familiar with the Schmidt and Hunter seminal meta-analysis from the 80s and 90s, where those researchers looked at a meta-analysis of, selection methods and how they impact on job performance. And in an update to that study, Sackett and his team of researchers found that the methods that actually predict performance have not changed. So structured, validated methods still win, and we're going to come back to this a bit later on in the conversation. All right, jumping into the meat of the content. What does AI do well? So we're going to use the analogy of a mirror, and I'm sure we'll all agree that AI is extremely good at reflecting back what you give it. So, AI is genuinely excellent when it comes to supporting humans with doing tasks, at high speed and scaling repetitive tasks. Great with using clear, structured output in a consistent way. And, realistically, not bringing in the errors that a human being may bring in if they were doing repetitive tasks all day. And then ultimately, the biggest benefit I would say is freeing up recruiters' time by removing some of the day-to-day administrative burden. On the other hand, where does AI fall short? All right. So if we continue the analogy of a mirror, the AI can only see what it's reflected, well, what's reflected in the mirror, not necessarily what's behind it or, beneath the surface of an iceberg. So an AI tool can only infer information from what it's fed, right? So it has no view of what's not on the page in front of it. Secondly, and I think very importantly, AI is by design a non-deterministic tool. Practically, what that means is if you ask an AI model the same question twice, you can get two different answers, which is fine if you're doing exploratory work or drafting an email, but it becomes a bigger problem when you have to stand behind a hiring decision that is made. Third, a related point, AI models are not, transparent. They are opaque. So what that means is you can get an answer out, but you can't see all of the elements used in the reasoning. It's a bit like a black box in a way. You can't see how A plus B became C. So you get this great confident answer. It's very polished. It makes you feel very confident, but you can't necessarily open it up and see how it got there. And there's a related risk worth noting as well, which is that, there are concerns about bias existing in AI and in AI processing. So one of the ones we want to note here is that, AI models have generally been trained more on English and disproportionately so on US English. So there could be a risk here that it reads US style CVs or communication as the right answer and anything else as perhaps a little bit weaker. However, I will say that, in the research, we do see that work is being done to close these bias gaps in the newer models of AI, which is really encouraging to see. And then lastly, a AI model, like I said, can only reflect what it sees. It cannot go below the surface. So if you're basing your decisions only on a CV or a screening questionnaire, you're not able to see a person's underlying potential at the end of the day. Which moves us into looking at the candidates in a little bit more detail, because candidates are actually holding up their own mirror to us as recruiters, which makes complete sense, right? They are just responding in kind. AI tools are being used on the applications, and they're using the AI tools in their own applications. So they're using AI to write and sharpen their CVs, to write cover letters, for example, and to reflect those back in terms of what are the keywords in the job ad, how should they tailor their application to meet the need, and like I said, highlight those and bring them to the fore in their application. You can see on the slide here, we also talk about cheating and mention interviews and assessments as possible sources of that. So what is Lumenei's experience with cheating? So we know from our experience in assessments that there will always be some percentage of people who cheat or who try and cheat. So we've built this into our psychometric assessments from the start. All right. And so with the rise of AI, we see that those same people who may have cheated before, maybe with a calculator in the past, will be tempted to use AI to their advantage, right? To, for example, help them, complete a cognitive assessment. But here's a shift in the way that recruiters think, which I would love to highlight at this stage. And that is if you take a well-written CV, right, an AI polished CV, and if you take a video interview answer where the person has used an AI tool to help shape their answers, and you look at them as inputs to your recruitment process, they're both just a polished self-report at the end of the day. So our challenge as recruiters used to be dealing with high volumes, right, and filtering people effectively. Now our focus needs to shift away from just filtering what candidates are telling us to verifying, to looking beneath the surface, right? And how can we actually get beneath the surface and, actually measure the true potential of a candidate? So that's what we also want to reflect on. But before we get there, I wanted to sum all of this up in terms of the biggest risk to organizations who are using AI in recruitment. So if you're starting off with bad input, like a bad prompt, which, for example, is like asking a general purpose AI model an open-ended question, you are going to be getting output that gives you an illusion of a good decision, even if there's nothing really behind it, right? Secondly, we mentioned earlier that it's non-deterministic, and that means that if your process is not specific enough, you could end up with outcomes that you cannot reproduce or you cannot defend in a regulated environment like recruitment. Speaking of regulations, we wanted to look at the landscape in South Africa and internationally and summarize what are the sort of main regulations or areas of legislation that are, notable to us as, HR professionals. With a very clear caveat that I'm talking through this as a psychologist, not as a, legal expert. All right, so it's very clear that AI regulations exist, that they're only going to become more comprehensive as time goes on. And just to summarize some of them, locally in South Africa, regulations already say that you cannot reject someone based solely on automated processing. That tells us we need a human in the loop, meaningfully, at all stages of the process. And we also need to emphasize elements such as transparency. Candidates need to know how they're being processed and what tools are being used, as well as giving them a route to challenge the outcomes. And then the EU goes further. They have, put forward AI as a high-risk process, and they've gone so far as to ban certain elements within the recruitment processes, like, for example, emotion recognition in video interviews. But at the end of the day, if we notice what regulators are asking for, they're asking for human oversight, they're asking for transparency, they're asking for an audit trail, decisions that you can defend and take accountability for. And if we have a good process from the start, that actually isn't an additional burden to us. It's just good practice. So, what now? We've summarized the fact that AI is a great tool. Most of the candidates are using it when they're applying to roles. And we've also seen that organizations can really benefit from it if they use it correctly to speed up and scale certain processes. But we've also seen that AI is a mirror. And so the quality of what you give it impacts on the quality of the information you get out. And so our take on this is not to be anti-AI, it's to be anti-lazy AI, right? We should be sure that we're using it in a disciplined way and we're using it in a multi-method approach. And we're going to go into some practical advice about that now. But I'd like to pause at this moment and ask another question from the audience in terms of, which areas do you feel are the most critical to balancing AI efficiency with high quality hiring? So it's a single choice. I know a lot of you may want to choose more than one, but I think choose the one that you feel is the most critical in your process to balance AI. And we'll just give the poll a minute to run and I'll have a short water break. And just to give you a synopsis of the results so far, we're actually seeing relatively even split across the options, but we'll show the results in a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, share the results, and run through the results. So like I said, relatively even split between competency-based interviewing, deep human review and intuition, and clearer AI usage policies and candidate transparency, which makes a lot of sense, right? And I do think when we think about AI, we think about the natural sort of protection against AI is the role of humans, right? And human wisdom and humans taking accountability for decisions. So that makes a lot of sense. All right. So we're going to talk about, like I said, some practical guidelines in terms of if you're already using AI, if you're one of the people that want to start using AI or are still a little bit cautious about it, here are some of Lumenei's sort of suggestions and recommendations. First one being the prompts. What are we actually asking an AI model to give us? So you could give AI a bad prompt. You could feed it a CV and say, is this a good candidate? You can feed it a number of CVs and say, which candidate is better for this role? So bad prompts have a couple of things in common. First of all, they're very broad. They don't give the AI model a lot of information to go off, and they don't give clear guidelines on how to respond. So ultimately, you're putting AI in the position of having to make those judgment calls for you, right? And so what you get out at the end of the day is a confident guess disguised as a clear decision. In comparison, an example of a good prompt could be, for example, pull out certain fields from these 3 CVs, cross-check them against the screening questionnaire that these people submitted, and mark them against the skills mentioned in the job description and against a clear scoring guideline. Right. Another example, does this candidate have the required level of seniority based on their listed job experience in their CV? Share examples of your reasoning. So good prompts are bounded, they're specific, they ask very specific questions. But I do want to note these are very brief examples, right? So actual good prompts are very detailed. For example, the ones we use at Lumenii for our recruitment tools are many, many pages long. What I wanted to share with you as well are some of the principles that we use when we build prompts in our organization. And you can see we've noted 6 principles there, which I'm going to run through very briefly. These are, first of all, the AI should have a defined role with firm boundaries. So they should know what they can do and what they're not allowed to do, right? With a human in the loop by design who can not only review the information, but also have the ability to push back or to override the information. Secondly, it should be grounded in evidence. So it should be able to integrate legislation, regulations, and other authoritative sources as it needs. It needs very explicit structured guidelines, like scoring rubrics, for example. And it needs to cite its evidence. We need to make sure that we're trying to make the model, you know, as transparent as possible, so that we're not dealing with this opaque response. So citing your evidence, noting where you got the answer from, and including clear guardrails to guard against bias. Principle 5, checking for integrity across sources of data to make sure that you have consistency. And principle 6, making sure that the output that you get follows the same structure so that you can reproduce it across different models, for example, and you are always, getting a similar structure of output for, across different candidates. All right, and then as a psychologist, I want to talk about some of the tools we use at Lumenii for our own recruitment, and that we, of course, use extensively with our clients, and that are firmly based on, what the research tells us, play an important role in recruitment. And looking at the poll results, also areas that, the audience feel are, valid and useful in their recruitment process. So very briefly, competency-based interviews. I mentioned earlier a study by Sackett and his colleagues who reviewed the Schmidt and Hunter meta-analysis. And what they found is if they looked at all the selection methodologies, structured interviews were the strongest predictors of job performance and twice the predictive validity compared to an unstructured interview. So why is that? Well, it's because it's a measurement. It's a structured measurement with a scoring scale that is very hard to fake. Because if you do it well, you are asking follow-up questions, you're probing for evidence, and it will expose a rehearsed answer very quickly. But we do need to note that your sort of methodology matters, because if you don't use a clear methodology, you run the risk of, not doing a proper structured interview. And what the research found is there's quite a lot of variance in the predictive power of structured interviews because people apply their methodologies in different ways. Secondly, in terms of practical tools, psychometric assessments, the real value for me in terms of psychometric assessments is the fact that they look at future potential. So a CV is what the person wants to tell you. An interview is also what they want to tell you. A structured interview is a lot more specific evidence of their performance in their current role and their previous role. But a psychometric assessment is the only thing that's going to tell you how does their potential stack up against the requirements of the next role. So we've spoken about candidates using AI in assessment taking, and of course, assessments can be impacted, by that, the same way that any other step in the recruitment process can be impacted upon by AI. But as I mentioned, there's always been people who try to game the selection process, and that's not new. It never was new. And what has changed is, not the fundamentals, but just the tools that they're using to do so. And the way that we safeguard against that is 2 ways. First of all, multi-method approach. I briefly mentioned earlier, consistency across your methods, looking and cross-checking your recruitment tools against one another to verify that there's a consistency of response or to note inconsistencies. For example, a cognitive tool, personality tool, structured interview, CV, etc. And then secondly, a good assessment process, right? So, the one that we use is a 3-step process, deterring cheating from the start, detecting it if it happens, and making sure that there's a step built in to verify results if needed. And then the last slide from me before we move on to the panel discussion, and thank you everyone for listening to me. I want to leave you with the simplest way I can frame this discussion. AI is about information at speed, at scale. Humans are about making decisions with wisdom. And so AI gives you information fast at scale, but only a human can bring wisdom, can bring judgment, can bring context, and ultimately can bring accountability for the decision. Thank you, everyone. And Sungula, I'm going to hand back to you. And I'm going to ask my other panelists to switch on your cameras and your microphones.
All right. Thank you for that, Caitlin. Excuse me. I think that's a very great kind of foundation for the next element of the webinar, which is to have a panel discussion with three of you. Before we get into that, I've got one kind of like poll to get us going. So, okay, so where do we see this headed? A little poll about, how you believe the role of the recruiter will evolve over the next 3 years as a result of other things Caitlin has been talking about. The options range from it becoming fully automated for high volume roles with recruiters only handling final interviews. They're saying other options that will shift to process management. Number saying it will remain largely the same. And two staying completely on the fence, 2% so far saying I'm unsure because the pace is so fast that it's quite difficult to predict at all. While we get those answers in there, I think we can start by looking at the first question, which I'd like to direct to you, Benjamin, which really looks at the where we're heading. Until a few years ago, people were using specialized AI tools such as video interviewing and transcript analysis. Now, Claude and ChatGPT are so powerful that they've become the go-to tools for everyone. What changes when one general purpose AI can suddenly see the CV, watch the interview, and score and do everything essentially, as opposed to what different tools that recruiters had in their arsenal, and now there's just one tool that can do almost everything. How does that impact the landscape?
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks, Caitlin. I must say, very interesting presentation. And Singula, thanks for the question. I think previously what we were seeing we were seeing AI methodologies being applied in discrete components to the process. For example, interview analysis or a video, or so it was kind of being used at various steps. Now what we see is the frontier LLMs are becoming sort of ever powerful and multimodal. They can actually do everything, and they actually do, all of these components very well. But what that does do, it sort of leads us into this trap or direction where we feel that they can do everything all at once. And I think that's really where the risk is. And I think that refers back to what Caitlin was saying, was that, we must really avoid this risk of taking some input, throwing it into something like Claude or Perplexity or whichever one we're using, and then getting an output that doesn't have a sort of traceability about how it got there. So the previous process was a lot more rigorous and reliable. And I think the idea is to try to extract those elements from the process that give us insight into information. And then, as Caitlin was saying, use human wisdom to interpret or discern from that information. We must be careful that information doesn't get consumed all within one step within these very powerful LLMs now.
Sure. Here's the results to the poll, with largely a large portion saying it'll become fully automated or it'll shift to process management, from process management to human connection and complex decision making. What are your thoughts on the results there, Benjamin?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I just sort of I'm personally on the last point, that I'm at the pace. And I'm sort of thinking about the interview that Elon Musk did with The Economist a couple of days ago, where they were talking about, what's the impact of AI on jobs and on the economy. And, he was sort of saying things are going to be so different in 10 years. Questions like, is money even going to be necessary? I do think it's going to create a lot of automation. I do think it's going to create a lot of ability for speed. I don't think it's going to take the human out of the process. I think that's an impossibility. The machine will never replace the human. I think it's absolutely critical that humans lead. At least that's what I see personally.
Mm. If I could jump in here, looking at the second option, the most chosen option about the emphasis shifting to human connection and complex decision making. That tells me that our recruiters' time is really going to be spent doing things like psychometric, um, reviewing the results of psychometric assessments and doing very good structured interviews. And so, the role of the recruiter might become then a lot more technical in terms of, what they need to be doing. And, maybe we need to then consider, technical skills, investing in that over time, because that's really going to be the main domain of recruiters.
I suppose
That's a great.
ultimately,
Sorry,
it's a
go ahead.
human, it's a human that sits in an office at the end of the
Mm,
day.
mm, 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 mm.
Sorry, Singular.
No, no, sorry. The I was going to say it's a great segue to the next question I want to ask. We have a question, a comment rather, from Wendy Nguni, who says some candidates are also using AI for assessments now, which is very worrying. And I guess, Hinton, I don't know, do you have any view on that, and whether there's maybe a best practice to approach competency-based interviews along with the assessment process? Do you have any ideas, or what's the best way to approach that?
Mm. Yes, thank you very much, Sungula. So we are seeing now that competency-based interviews are becoming a verification layer and process rather than just another evaluation step in our previously defined recruitment process that included various elements. So while it's still really important to use multiple sources of information so that you can triangulate your decision making and your information, I would say that the competency-based interview does become an important verification step. And in a way, competency-based interviewing by its very nature does become AI proof, but it does also depend to a large extent on the skill of the individual doing the interview. So if I can just off the top of my head think of a few best practices. The first one is to stick quite diligently to your STAR process and to utilize your STAR probes to make sure that you're not just getting a rehearsed answer. So typically, an individual that uses AI to prepare might get past your first STAR probe. But if you ask a second and a third one, it's less likely that AI is going to prepare you for that second and third probe. And make the probes very specific. Ask for details like who was involved, what was the impact, what was your actual role, who made the decision, and so on. Then the next thing that I can think of is that very often CBI's competency-based interviews will ask an individual to reflect on previous performance. Remember, there are nuances to the questions, so we don't need to only rely on the reflection of previous performance. We can also investigate consistency of performance. So not just tell me about a time, but also tell me about how you make sure you do it consistently over time. And then we can also ask questions about not just when it went well, but tell me about a time it didn't go well. What did you learn from that? And what did you put in place to make sure that you actually do perform well in future? When you are actually scoring and assessing the responses, so remember, this is relying on a technical behavior observation, which once again is dependent on the individual's level of skill in behavior observation. But to make your task easier, make sure that it is as structured as possible. So you have a fixed rubric, you have your competencies well defined, you have your behavioral indicators well laid out, and you need to avoid being influenced by the fluency and confidence of the individual. So if you stick to your very structured rubric, you are more likely to score the person as objectively as possible. I think I read in the comments somewhere something about bias. As human beings, we are prone to bias. So, as a behavior observation assessor, be aware of your biases. And also, don't read too much into body language, what we've been told about body language, things like eye contact and so on. Remember, these things can be quite culturally specific. So don't rely too much on those. And then also don't rely on AI telling you whether this was an AI generated response. Like Benjamin and Caitlin both indicated, you need to introduce the human judgment here, and you as a human being need to make the judgment call about whether that was a genuine response or not. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you as a human being, you need to own that decision. You need to be able to verify why you made that decision. Like Caitlin said, AI tends to be opaque, but you need to be able to demonstrate why you arrived at a particular decision.
Anything to add, Caitlin?
No, I think, Jayanthan, you covered it. As a research psychologist and someone who studies the validity of different methods, for me, like I said earlier, it's all about using a good methodology, making sure that you're using quantitative methods to score your structured interview, and yeah, making sure that your people who are actually doing the interviews, including hiring managers, are trained so that they, follow these methodologies, because only then is it really going to be as powerful of a tool as the research suggests.
Gentlemen, you mentioned the STAR methodology a couple of times. Maybe one or two comments on what the STAR actually stands for in that.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm using the acronym, just assuming everyone understands it. So in CBI language, STAR is an acronym for situation, task, action, and result. So basically, we're saying you need to formulate your question so that it elicits a response about a particular situation, the task the person had to perform in that situation, what they actually did, the A, and then what the outcome of that was. And these are designed to allow the person to express evidence of performance in various competency areas.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about that is it's literally AI proof. It's that human looking for that human experience at the end of the day. I really resonate with what you were saying, gentlemen, that, sure, somebody might get through step one, but at the end of the day, in that verification step where you are really probing underneath and getting those human to human answers and that resonance with the role, I think that's that ultimate part of the hiring decision.
Yeah, and make no mistake, it does take a little bit of skill. So it's going to take some practice for you as an interviewer to actually get comfortable and be able to draw out all four of those aspects of an answer from a candidate.
I have a question here from Tori, so I'm going to go straight into some of the questions here because there's so many. I think we'll have to give a shadow spotlight on some of these, which are very good. For example, Polisa Malingi says, how can you prove that investing in AI recruitment provides a more favorable return than investing in verified psychometric tests and structured interviews? Caitlin, perhaps you can answer this one and maybe shed some light on what organizations do well and what some do poorly in terms of, firstly, this ROI conversation, and then secondly, maybe there's a balance that needs to be struck in terms of both approaches.
Thank you, Sangula. I think that's a very interesting question. I think there shouldn't be a choice between the different methods. I believe that AI will increasingly have a role in recruitment. That's my personal opinion. And I definitely believe you can't do without structured interviews or psychometric assessments, because otherwise you're just relying on the surface level of the iceberg and you're not getting to the deeper levels. In terms of, when we look at our clients, when we look at what we're hearing in the marketplace and what organizations are doing well and what they're doing less well, a lot of it I covered already in the slides, the good prompts, the bad prompts, not putting in vague information, putting in specific information, and, making sure that you're getting good quality information out that you can apply judgment and wisdom to. But to expand on that, a couple of other points that, I think are good practice in terms of doing it well, making sure you have an AI policy in place, making sure that your HR specialists are trained, if you're writing your own prompts on prompt engineering, for example, and if you're using an outside tool to make sure that it demonstrates validity, reliability, and that you can, trust it and stand behind it confidently. And then another thing I would say is disciplined scaling of AI. So if you're a small business, if you're starting off and you don't quite know where to start small and roll it out incrementally and make sure that once again you can stand behind it confidently and show its return on investment. What we see organizations doing wrong, besides, the examples we mentioned earlier, one of the things I can think about is not using AI in the right places, right? So one thing I could recommend is look at where your recruiters are, bleeding time. Look at what their main pain points are. For example, scheduling interviews that you could possibly bring technology in or AI or technology in to support with. Maybe it's following up with candidates, things like that. So look at where you can use it that'll have the biggest impact, while of course not eroding, the role of the human. And the second point is take note of what your hiring managers are doing, right? So we speak to a lot of companies where the hiring managers popping the CV and the psychometric assessment into ChatGPT, and they're saying, help me make my final decision. Because that's what they do on their day-to-day work, right? They're using AI in almost everything they're doing. Most of us are. And they maybe don't understand that in recruitment, there are regulations, there are requirements, and there are risks associated with that. So definite recommendation is make sure that AI literacy and the AI role of AI in recruitment is well understood company-wide, as well as, people are equipped to use AI responsibly, not just in HR, but throughout the company.
Yeah, to your point, Vanessa Roth says to everyone, please never put candidate CVs into AI LLMs because that's sensitive data which does not belong to you and contravenes the EU AI Act. So that's an example of some kind of regulatory boundaries that people need to be aware of before they implement some of these tools. Another good question has come from Nolan Mortar, saying, has anyone created a recruitment AI bot in line with their business requirements for the roles they recruit for? And does AI build that kind of thing? Similar question is from Marinique Basson, is how do you create AI bots that standardize screening and eliminates bias about recruitment? And also, I guess, is there a way to use that to do that using the platforms that are widely popular right now, which is the Claudes and the ChatGPTs right now. Benjamin, do you have a comment on the service, I guess, that Lumenii provides in this in this question?
Absolutely. So I mean, number one, we see people creating AI bots all the time. It's a sort of standard go-to. And I think what's very important is to avoid the risks that Caitlin was mentioning. So yeah, Lumenii tools. I mean, our tools do employ AI. Going back to the previous question, should the investment be in an AI type of solution or into psychometrics? In our opinion, it's not a or question. It's an and question. It's about using the best of both. So when we creating AI bots or AI processes, it's very important to use AI in a way that you're going to get clear, defendable, reproducible answers for discrete parts of the process. Very often that's used in pulling out information, pulling out structured information out of an unstructured CV, as an example, and then also being able to verify that that's being done correctly. But what we would never do is we would never have a bot or an AI system make a decision or even make a recommendation based on information that is only surface level. I mean, that's the bottom line. Is the biggest risk in creating an AI bot, so to speak, is that we're going to be biasing people in or out only on information that's provided, and more this information is actually provided by AI itself. people polishing their CVs or their cover letters via AI. So, I think the bots, they should really, create efficiencies in the process. They should help us translate unstructured information into structured information, but they should really feed into a rigorous process with multiple steps. And Lumenii does employ this in our recruitment and other solutions.
Thanks for that. I've launched one more poll to get a sense for what is everyone's biggest concern around AI. Is it the candidates came in the system? Is it the non-predictive data that is implemented? Is it using the human touch, or is it legal, ethical, or bias-related risks? All of which I think are all relevant, but it would be interesting to see which one keeps recruiters most awake at night. And it seems like losing the human touch is a big one, which is interesting because a lot of the value that is marketed from these tools is that you will need less of a recruitment team, for example, because now you have most of this. But then the biggest concern is that you're going to lose the human touch, which is what that recruitment team does. Your thoughts on that, Caitlin?
Yeah, so as you were talking, I was thinking about a study that I read recently, which said that, the volume of applications has increased enormously. I can't remember the exact study attribution, but the figure was around 412% increase in the volume of applications between like 2021 and I think it was 2025, right? And the same study mentioned that the recruitment manpower in organizations has dropped by approximately 50%. So you're dealing with more applications, you're dealing with AI polished applications, but you're also possibly dealing with less manpower on the ground to work through it. So when we think about the landscape in 2 years' time, my personal opinion, like I said, is that AI will need to play a role to support recruiters to keep up. But as we've mentioned, in its own lane and, respecting the role of the humans. Looking at the poll results, yeah, I do agree that losing the human touch is something that we are all concerned about. It's also, for me, ties back to candidate experience, right? An employee value proposition that you don't want to come across as cold and impersonal. You want candidates to have a good experience. You don't want them to be over-analyzed. You don't want to do anything unethical or against regulations. So, yeah, in that sense, that one also stands out to me.
Gentlemen, not one of the most, I think the other options are quite equal in terms of the fears of the people in the room. I'm surprised because I thought that candidates gaming the system was going to be one of the highest of the answers. Certainly that's an assumption I made based on how I see people using AI to submit CVs to us and motivation letters. What's your view on our candidates gaming the system, and is there a right way to do it? Because ultimately the value from AI comes from the way in which you use it. And some candidates will be able to use it to thoughtfully prepare, research the company, sharpen their own thinking in preparing for an interview rather than simply regurgitating what AI spits out at them. What's your view on this particular element of how AI has impacted recruitment?
Yeah, so I think we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, like you alluded to, AI skills are going to be critical in the workplace, or are already critical in the workplace. And Caitlin and Benjamin both mentioned this, that we can't get by doing our work without using AI in some way. So we don't necessarily want to penalize people for using AI, because you might actually be looking for those skills. And using AI to prepare for your interview is a little bit like, getting a career coach or a mentor to help you prepare for that interview if it's used responsibly. But I think where the line becomes blurred and, there's a transgression is where an individual uses AI to misrepresent themselves. So instead of just preparing for an interview, understanding the organization and so on, doing the research, but then fabricating possible answers to interview questions, to non-negotiable hard criteria in the application process and so on, I think that's when it, for me, becomes an issue. And I'd also just like to reflect on a bit of a historic parallel. If we think about approximately 2 decades ago, when online testing was becoming introduced into the industry, there was a lot of anxiety around it at first. And my feeling is that that anxiety very quickly dissipated, and online testing has become very much a part of the way we do things now. We don't even think about it anymore. And I would like to think that the situation with AI is going to be similar. And maybe I'm going to be a little bit naive and optimistic. So here's the human element coming in, my human optimism. I'm hoping that as the assessment culture matures in South Africa, not just with candidates, but with organizations as well, that candidates will more and more appreciate that uh, assessments and the whole recruitment process is not just gatekeeping, but it's also about identifying a good person role fit, which benefits not just the organization, but the individual. And with that realization, I'm hoping that AI will be used more responsibly, to prepare and to maybe enhance a little bit and not to misrepresent the individual. So there's a very long answer to your question. Hopefully, I did get to the answer, Sungula.
Well, I think that's. Anybody else want to add either on the poll results or?
Yeah, maybe just on that, there's this natural instinct for people to be concerned, as Jenton was saying, and I think back to what Caitlin was saying, one has to embrace these things, but what we do is, we would look to, be clear about what is and what is not appropriate in the process. Look for things that are not appropriate. And also be realistic and have various mechanisms to verify at the end. Because if somebody's going to game the system and get through step one, then they shouldn't get through step two, and they certainly shouldn't get through step three. So it's about using the process well, and being upfront with people what is okay and what's not okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
I wanted to just add, that speaks to what I mentioned earlier about deter, detect, and verify, right? So, a great way to also minimize AI cheating is to make sure that you deter people away from it in the first place. Make them sign something that says they will not cheat, and that if it is picked up, they won't, there's a possibility that they will be asked to recomplete. And I do think that will cause a proportion of people to think twice and before continuing to use it, for example, in an assessment or interview.
Yeah, the research actually very much supports that knowledge and that upfront promise, so to speak, has a very significant impact on people actually acting ethically when they undertake these processes.
All right, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm not going to ask any more questions. Just maybe some parting shots from the panel on what should be, if you had to pick one thing for everybody to take away from this conversation. I'll give you each a chance, and we've got 2 minutes, so if you can keep it brief, that would be great. Start with you, Benjamin. What's the one thing that you think people in this conversation should take away as their main learning, if you will?
Yeah, I think, as powerful as the LLMs are, please don't just ask the LLM to choose whether somebody is fit for the job or not. Certainly use the LLM for steps, help it create efficiencies, but don't rely on it. Don't let it replace the humans. Let it support the humans.
Lovely, Jenton.
Yeah, my last comment is a little bit similar to Benjamin's. A few years ago, the World Economic Forum's report indicated that, with the next industrial revolution, we're going to see the reintroduction of the human element into the workplace. So that's what I want to remember, and for people to remember, that we can't replace human beings in the workplace.
And lastly, Caitlin.
Thank you. I have 2 points. The first one is if you're going to set out to build AI prompts, please don't use the free version of AI because then your data is being sent away to help train the models. On a paid version, you can switch that feature off. Obviously, it depends on the AI tool that you're using, but please do check that if you are using it internally. Second point, I can imagine this feels overwhelming. So if you're stuck, if you need help, you don't have to do it by yourself. We have AI-enabled, ready-to-go recruitment tools that we offer, and we can also give you support, training, and so on. So please feel free to get in touch, and we're happy to chat.
All right, thank you. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to close the webinar. Some really interesting learnings that the panel has shared with us, and I feel a little bit more enlightened as well. Just a few notes on what's next. You will receive a recording, which will go out in the next couple of days, as well as the team from Lumenii will be in touch with the winner of the Take a Lot prizes for the most, I think it was the best question during Q&A and the best comment. And they will also be in touch just to follow up. There were lots of questions and we'll send them everything from the discussion. So if there's anything that we didn't get into during the webinar, they will address it with you directly. Otherwise, thank you very much for spending your time with us this morning. Thank you to the panel and enjoy the rest of your day and week.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much,
Cheers.
everyone.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.